This story occurred many years ago, but to this day it remains very latent in my memories, because at the time it was very magical for me. I think that if I had seen him at the age I am now, I would most likely have died of fear. But when I was a child, my mind did not have that fear. Innocence can be satisfactory when there are no corruptions in your mind. I still remember it as if it had been yesterday, and I am certain that it was real, because even at that age I could differentiate between what is real and what is not. I consider myself an intelligent person, because from a very young age I realized that there are things that science cannot explain, but that, nevertheless, are there. I was 11 years old when it happened, and I lived in the Lomas Verdes neighborhood, in Mexico City, at my grandparents' house. Very close to my house there was a somewhat large park that had some old wooden swings along with a slide. It was a very beautiful green area that everyone in the neighborhood respected and cared for. In this park there was a very old and large tree, with a very wide trunk, dark brown branches, quite twisted, and large leaves of a bright green color. I really loved going to this park after school, when my parents worked and my grandfather took care of me. My grandfather allowed me to go to the park as long as he returned in a couple of hours. At most I was 2 blocks from my house, and at that time there was not much insecurity, so there was no problem. Once I got to the park, I liked to go to this tree and climb it to sit on one of its thick branches that leaned horizontally. On this open branch there were a couple of ropes hanging down, but they were broken. From the way they were tied, I assumed that at some point there was a makeshift swing created with a wooden board and a couple of ropes. Although I never saw that swing, I once asked my grandfather to help me make a new one with another wooden board and using new ropes. He insisted that he use the ones that were already in the park, a few meters from the tree, but I insisted, because I didn't like the other swings. For some reason, being under that tree gave me a security that seemed inexplicable to me. Finally, my grandfather agreed and helped me put up the new swing. I was very happy because almost no one swung on it and it made me feel unique. A couple of months later, my grandfather let me go later than usual, because all day I saw him busy studying for my exams, and my reward was to go to the swing to feel free for a while. Since I was completely alone, there was no one but me in it, and I could hear the crickets singing under the light of a beautiful October full moon. I really liked watching the stars on a night like that, so I climbed to the top of the tree and just stayed there contemplating the sky for a while. After a few moments, I began to hear the swing below swaying, but this didn't seem strange to me because the wind could easily have been moving it. However, little by little it began to sway more strongly, and I soon realized that these movements were not generated by the wind. I stood watching the swing without knowing what to do. Finally, I decided to go down and get on it to try to detect what was causing these movements. However, when I did, the swing stopped moving. I began to sway a little and continued trying to reason what had happened when, suddenly, I heard the mischievous laughter of a little girl very close by. I looked everywhere for the girl I had heard, but she didn't see anyone, so I asked into the air. "Who's there? Who is it?" Nobody answered. I continued swinging, trying to listen more attentively, because I came to think that perhaps I had imagined that chuckle. Suddenly, I began to feel how the swing was moving on its own, because, even though I was not pushing it, it began to go higher and higher. I gripped the ropes as hard as I could and couldn't help but let out a scream as I swung again. I heard that laugh again. This time it was very clear, although I couldn't determine where it came from, but without a doubt it was close. I tried to use my weight to stop the swing, but all in vain. This only lasted a few seconds, but I felt very helpless knowing that I had no control of the swing. When it finally stopped, I quickly got off and looked around for whoever was responsible. I didn't feel afraid, but I did feel annoyed by the girl who was laughing, since she didn't appear before me. So again I shouted into the air. "Girl, come, show yourself, go. I will not hurt you. We can be friends if you want. I don't have friends and you could be the first." An abrupt silence reigned throughout the park. I even remember that I stopped hearing the crickets sing, not even the wind could be heard. At that moment, I heard the branches of the tree at the top move, and when I looked again at what was causing it, I saw the silhouette of a girl who had already positioned herself on the highest branch of the tree. I couldn't see her well, as the shadows largely hid her, so I decided to go up with her. I climbed the tree as quickly as I could, and when I got to the top, there was no one there. I got angry again because I thought the girl was playing with me and she was hiding from me. The frustration made me want to cry, and I couldn't help but do so. Then, something very strange happened. I felt as if someone was whispering into the back of my neck words that, at first, were intangible to me, but that I later understood better. Someone was repeating the word friend. For a moment, I was very happy that this girl really wanted to be my friend, but unfortunately, the magic soon ended, because at that moment my grandfather arrived calling me by my name again and again. He sounded very upset, so I got down from the tree and went in search of him. When I found him, he asked me why it had taken so long, and I didn't really have an answer, because, after everything that had happened, he hadn't realized how much time had passed. Apparently, it had been much more than I imagined. It was almost 10 at night. I went home to sleep, but in my head I couldn't stop thinking about that girl in the tree who would surely be waiting for me the next day. So I decided to go again at the same time the next day. However, no matter how much I tried to call her, she no longer showed her presence. I went for several days hoping she would show up again, but she didn't. I never saw or heard the girl again, even though I went several times. However, a few years later I met some neighbors who became my friends, and we went to play in the park every day. It was then that one of them told me that, like me, she had also heard the girl in the tree once, and her sister said that, on another occasion, she had also seen her. It couldn't be a coincidence that we all saw and heard the same thing in the same place. Some time later, I met other neighbors who became friends with my parents. It was an elderly couple who was very friendly and told us that they had been living in that neighborhood for more than 50 years. So I decided to ask them if they had ever heard or seen a girl in the tree in the park, and their answer surprised me a lot, as it explained a lot of everything. It turns out that, a long time ago, a father and mother who lived in the neighborhood were getting divorced. They argued daily and had a little daughter who was only 8 years old. She, trying to escape the situation at her house, went to the park so as not to hear her parents argue. She liked to climb the tree to the highest branch, and that was where, one day, tragedy occurred. The girl had run out of her house crying after seeing her father assault her mother, and she was especially upset. So, when she climbed the tree, she tripped and fell, breaking her neck. The girl died at that moment. This whole story gave some meaning to what happened to me, and I soon realized that she had not been the only one to experience something like that. Many boys and girls who went to play in that park daily had witnessed and experienced things very similar to my case. As I already mentioned, to this day the memory is very latent in me and has made me wonder many times if that girl, who is no longer in this world, was perhaps looking for friends to play with. Paranormal experiences are often described as terrifying, and they are not wrong. However, most people expect to see a ghost or observe how something affects them for themselves. But I think that uncertainty and unrelieved suspense are much more terrifying than seeing any entity. At least this way, you know what you're dealing with. In my case, the experience that I will tell you left a mark on me and, for a long time, I remembered it as the most terrifying thing in my life. It happened many years ago, when I was only 17. At that time, I constantly went to my dad's house to visit him. He lived in a town with no more than 300 inhabitants, in the state of Chiapas. Even so, my father lived on a ranch on the outskirts of said town, about 10 minutes away. Legends and myths of a paranormal nature are common in that town, and many people say they have seen all kinds of creatures in its borders, from goblins and fairies to witches. I, despite believing in all these stories, never witnessed one to that extent. Whenever I went to visit my dad, I prayed that I wouldn't have to experience anything of a paranormal nature. My father's house lacked electricity, and that is why I had a special love for his entire ranch, since arriving at night it was almost impossible to glimpse anything outside. Apart from this, fog was very common in that region and that only made things worse. On all the occasions that I visited my dad, I slept in a room on the upper floor that had a tin roof, and this made it difficult to hear the noises of the night, the noises of insects and the howling of dogs in the distance outside. Something very simple. Therefore, once the night had fallen, I tried not to stop anywhere. I even avoided going to the bathroom after 8 that night. My dad told me that many people claimed to see the devil himself wandering around that area, which caused me to spend most of the time looking around, praying not to see anything or anyone. However, one of those nights when I went to visit, I was getting ready to sleep. My father said goodnight to me and went to his room, which is on the ground floor of the house. I tried to fall asleep, but suddenly realized that that day in particular was cold like no other. I wrapped myself in 2 blankets and warmed my legs by hugging them. Still, the cold was too much. I was about to stop to look for something else to warm myself up with, but just at that moment I began to hear a tinkling sound that was increasing in intensity every moment. It was a metal object that hit a rocky surface with a thunderous sound. I didn't know what was causing the noise and I tried to give him an explanation. I came to the conclusion that it was the hanging bucket we used to draw water from the rock well in the yard. But that was extremely strange, since said bucket was quite heavy, and from the bangs that could now be heard it seemed that someone was furiously dropping it against the rock. There was something in the atmosphere that gave me a bad feeling, like when you feel like someone or something is watching you. By this point, I was already quite scared and tried to think that maybe it was just the wind, which was blowing sharply that night. I reasoned that it was all in my head. The bucket continued to thrash more and more constantly. I couldn't believe that my father didn't get up to see what was happening with such a noise. I looked out the window to see if he could see anything, but the fog and darkness did not allow me to do so. Suddenly, the sounds that I had already mentioned were joined by very fast footsteps, similar to those of a dog, although somewhat different, as if it were something much faster. They could be heard outside, covering the entire perimeter of the property. Then I thought that perhaps it was some animal passing by, since that was perfectly normal in that region. However, it was strange that they arrived at that time of night. Again I tried not to think about it too much and calm down, but suddenly the sound of running footsteps began to be heard inside the house. It was not possible that what was running could have entered so easily, since my dad always padlocked all the doors and windows. Without a doubt, those footsteps could be heard through the corridor below. I didn't know what to do at that moment. My curiosity told me to go and see to realize that it was some kind of animal that found a way to get in, but my instinct told me not to do it. It could be a simple animal, but if it wasn't, and if it was something else, something unknown. As I thought all this, that sound came closer until I was sure that whatever it was now outside my door. I jumped up and grabbed my blankets to gather them against me. Uncertainty gnawed at me. I didn't know what was out there. It could be anything. However, the sound did not stop, and I was even more afraid, because I did not know where that thing was now. I began to turn around, full of fear, expecting to see something emerge from the darkness at any moment, but moments passed that seemed endless and nothing simply happened. I thought everything had already happened, but when I felt a little more relieved, another sound perpetuated the silence. This time it was a bellow, like a horse's, but it sounded close, very close, like it was right outside my window. Now, my father had no horses on his property and, as far as I knew, neither did anyone else nearby. It kept ringing and seemed to come from different places, as if the thing could teleport from one place to another in a matter of seconds. It sounded once on the right and the next on the left. At that moment I wished I could see what all those things were that were causing the noises. The uncertainty of not knowing what it was about filled me with panic. My mind was alive trying to find a logical or reasonable explanation. Finally, another sound broke out. This was the most chilling of all, the sound of heavy, rusty chains dragging outside. Like the previous sound, this one also seemed to come from everywhere, and even from inside the house. I thought maybe it was my dad, but he never went out without a lamp, and if so, I could see it from my window. The sound resonated with such a roar that it even hurt my ears. Every time I heard it louder and closer, until I also heard it outside my door. I expected what was outside to come in suddenly, but it didn't. I even heard those chains scrape against the wood of my door and, for a moment, I could see a shadow projected beneath it. My muscles were so stiff and tense that I even stopped feeling the cold. I didn't know what to do at that moment, so the only thing I could think of was to say a prayer, and I did so for several minutes that seemed like forever, until, finally, the sound of the chains became increasingly distant. More until disappearing into the silence of the night. I felt very tired and, incredibly, after that I just closed my eyes and slept. When I woke up, I didn't want to tell my father what happened because he knew he wouldn't believe me. However, that night was and remains the most terrifying night of my life. To this day, I fear hearing any of those sounds again. Like I said, what was stalking me made the experience more terrifying than any. This was my testimony and I hope he likes it, because that's how I lived it. I am from the city of Saltillo, in the state of Coahuila, and throughout my childhood a religion taught to me by my parents was instilled in me. However, when I grew up, I decided that I should form my own opinion and not obey the faith that others imposed on me. I decided to find out about various religious currents. Finally, I met a great friend, who taught me about his philosophy of life. Since then, my faith has been constantly growing. My life was the most enjoyable since my spirituality and my mentality agreed. After many years, I finally found true peace of mind that led me to beneficial paths. But, unfortunately, this did not last forever. Like everything in this life, nothing is static, there will always be cause and movement that will affect everything. Many times, this chaos is represented in the form of people, and in this case, it was one of the people from whom I least expected it. We lived quietly, we had been living together for 4 years now and I felt very good. He worked at a shoe company and had his own clothing business for a couple of years. Between both things, it was enough for me to support my expenses and those of my girlfriend. However, not everything was going well, as my health had been affected by my terrible eating habits. With the help of a doctor, I gradually resolved my situation. This was my life during some years of battle, and in all of them, my girlfriend was the best companion of all. She was always aware of me and my care. Sometimes I had problems with her because of strong skepticism on the part of her in front of me. On many occasions she questioned me about why she believed in a religion, since she considered herself a Gnostic, and it was a recurring argument in our relationship. However, it was never something to worry about, at least until the inexplicable happened. One day, most of the time, I felt it was necessary to go to my parents' house to explain my medical situation to them, since up to that point I had preferred to avoid the topic with them. In that talk with my parents, an unusual topic of conversation came up. They wanted to know about my girlfriend's beliefs, since they told me that days before she had gone to talk to them to tell them that she was very worried about me due to my blind faith in non-existent things. However, after that, the conversation became much more tense, as she threatened my parents to convince me to leave my religion. Obviously, they would never do something like that, and that's why they told me everything. Even so, they were afraid of what this could cause, since my girlfriend had also threatened them if they told me anything. All of this seemed very strange to me, because I couldn't believe that my girlfriend could have done something like that, and I wasn't going to distrust the word of my parents, who had never lied to me in their life. I decided that I should confront my girlfriend face to face so she could explain this to me. When I got home, she was washing dishes. I tried to ask her as insightfully as I could, so that she wouldn't take it the wrong way. After all, he had no intention of pushing her away. I thought she would have her reasons for doing what she had done, and I wanted to hear what they were. It was then that I discovered her true attitude and noticed that, the entire time we had been dating, she had been wearing a mask with me. Well, as soon as I confronted her, she dropped her nice side and started openly criticizing me about my beliefs. I decided that it was time to break up with her, since it was something that I personally could not accept. She got very angry and even threatened me, telling me that I would pay dearly if I didn't fall into her trap. I just ignored her and asked her to get away from it. She took her things and left, but when I checked my belongings after she left, I realized that she had taken most of my medicines. I felt betrayed. Now, a lump in my throat made it impossible for me to cry, although I had no shortage of desire. After those events, I decided it was time to be alone and face myself, and I did so for a few months. But I soon found someone who truly appreciated me and accepted everything about me, including my religious beliefs. During the time I was dating this girl, very strange things started happening at my house and then everywhere I went, including at work. In the house, I started seeing a lot of insects, like cockroaches and bedbugs, even though I always kept everything clean. For some reason, it always smelled bad. Also, on a couple of occasions, I felt someone whisper my name from the other room or heard wails coming from the kitchen while I was sleeping. On the other hand, in my work I also had to experience strange situations. Sometimes they would call my office phone and there would be no one on the other end. People could sometimes be heard running in the hallways when no one was there, and several colleagues even claimed to have seen shadows near me dissipate when I moved elsewhere. Many of them recommended me to shamans or witches, because they thought someone had sent me a curse. However, I had faith that things would resolve naturally. On one occasion, I was ready to go to bed after a very busy day. When I lay down, something under my bed began to hit the mattress roughly. When I bent down to see what was underneath, that was the last straw, because I found some kind of ritual under my bed with some bags full of what looked like blood and a piece of meat inside. There were ashes around it and a circle drawn in red in the center. That's when it all made sense to me. That was clearly a ritual or a curse imparted by a witch. I realized that my ex-girlfriend never accepted my beliefs and wanted to take advantage of my lack of faith to impose hers on me, but she never succeeded. In revenge, she decided to place that curse under my bed. That made me reconsider my options and I ended up getting help from one of the shamans my classmates had recommended to me. Luckily for me, she managed to eradicate any trace of the curse. A couple of years later, I ran into my ex-girlfriend at the supermarket and realized that she had changed a lot. He was almost unrecognizable, she looked emaciated and lifeless. The only thing I could feel for her now was pity, because, as I said before, a person without respect for the sacred will be destined to suffer forever.